Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to consider a second example of a soil study. In the first soil study, you will have been thinking about studying the changes in soil characteristics on a slope, investigating how the altitude, that's how high above sea level you are, and the gradient of the slope influences a variety of different soil characteristics, like the moisture content of the soil depth, the soil acidity, and so on and so forth. So clearly, in this case, the independent variable is both the gradient, the angle of the slope, and the altitude. And it will in some way influence all the other characteristics of the soil as you move down that slope. In the second study, we're looking at a soil study from a different point of view. We're thinking about gathering data on soil across an area. So here we have a Google image to show an agricultural area with a range of different types of fields. We can see that through the coloration of the fields being different across this landscape. And the first thing we're going to have to consider is what type of sample size are we going to need to gather in order to gather accurate data. Let's first of all think about what data do we want to gather. So if we are researching the impact that land use has on soil characteristics, we need to gather soil samples. And those soil samples will enable us to study the moisture content of the soil, the organic content of the soil, the pH of the soil. We could, at each of these locations, we could get the soil depth if we wanted, and as well as other things that we can investigate if we have a soil sample. If we're wanting to look at what the land is used for and how it influences soil, well, then we have to visit a range of different locations with different land uses. So using Google Earth, we can first start with Google Earth to try to identify different land uses. So we can clearly see this field is being used for one type of agriculture, which is different from this field, which is different from this field, which is different from this field. So our sampling strategy is going to have to reflect the ability for us to choose our locations based on land use. Now, in this case, it's most suitable that we would go with a stratified sampling strategy, which is a strategy that allows us to choose the locations that we are visiting. And the reason for that is that because we're wanting to study different land uses and how they influence soil, we are going to have to find and ensure we go to different land uses. If we were to use random, we might end up with all of ours being in these same fields, and these are all the same. So we wouldn't get to see any difference. Likewise, if we were to use systematic, we might miss out a number of land uses because our systematic strategy would be equally spread across the area. And it might just be that they were all grass fields, and we might miss out these fields altogether. So that's why we need stratified. Next question to ask ourselves is how many samples do we need? Okay. Now, this isn't an easy question to answer, but clearly one sample from each type of land use would not be enough. And if we were to identify, for example, that there were 10 different types of land uses in this landscape, 10 different types of crops, or 10 different things that the fields are being used for, then we would want to at least visit one example from each. If we thought that was maybe risky, that we need to actually visit, for example, if this is a wheat field, we need to maybe visit 3 different wheat fields on this landscape, and 3 different grass fields, and 3 different potato fields. Well, once again, we'd need to make sure we adjusted our sampling size. So a sampling size is always, the general rule of thumb is the bigger the sample, the better your average data is going to be. So the more different fields you visit, the more likely you're going to have a better average. And also, the greater variety of different land uses we study, the easier it's going to be to contrast the effect that the land use has on the soil. Okay, so when you think about those things, you're going to have to decide on your size. So let's have a little look at the question. Explain how you would gather relevant data to complete a soil analysis that will allow you to investigate the influence of farming land uses on soil characteristics. So the first thing you're going to have to write is about an appropriate sampling strategy. And you're going to have to explain why that sampling strategy was used. So why did you select the number of locations you did? And why did you use a stratified sampling technique to select those locations? And that's based on everything I've just said. Second part of this question is you should explain in detail 2 techniques you would use to gather data. Okay. Now, in the previous soil study, number 1, you will have explored a range of strategies used to gather soil samples. And you can use that information in your second answer. What's important though is that you always say how that ensures you gather relevant data. That's the key word. So if you're going to gather a soil sample from 5 different land uses that you've identified using Google Earth, and then you've used an Ordnance Survey map to find those locations, how do you ensure it's relevant data? Well, you ensure that from each field you might get 5 soil samples. What you then need to do is tell me, how do you get those soil samples? Well, that's where the soil auger comes in. So that's one of the tools that you use. That's where you drill a soil core and you pull it out. But where do you take the soil from off the auger? Once you pull it out of the soil, you have to tell me whether you're going to take the soil from the middle of the core or the bottom or the top, and why do you have to decide where to take it from, because clearly that's the depth the soil has come from, and you need to be consistent across all your locations. Otherwise, you will not end up with relevant data. You also have to tell me that you're going to visit a range of land uses, because if you don't, then how is it possible to study the influence that land use has on soil if you've only got one land use? And why would you have to maybe get more than one soil core per field? Because the location you get your soil core from might not be actually representative of the whole field. There might be something unusual in that location. So you might need to get multiple samples from the same field in order to guarantee that you get representative data of the whole field. And you would need a strategy, a sampling strategy, to select those locations from that field. You don't just walk into a field and drill 5 random holes, or maybe you do if you're using a random sampling strategy, but then you have to tell me how you select those locations. Now, it does say 2 techniques. I've talked a lot about gathering a soil core. What else might you, in order to test it, what might you then do with that soil core? So you have to actually expand on that. Once you've got the soil, you've got to tell me, how do you get the data from the soil? So how would you get the pH data? How would you ensure it was accurate? How would you get the soil moisture data? How would you ensure that the soil moisture was accurate? So you've got to tell me about the technique you would use that would ensure you're getting accurate and relevant data. If you want to get the soil depth, how would you do that? And would you just do one soil depth per field? Or would you do multiple? If you're interested in the gradient and how the gradient in the field might possibly influence the soil characteristic, how would you get the gradient data, and how would you ensure it was accurate? This question is really important, that you explain in detail, not just a technique, but why you're using that technique and how that technique ensures relevant and accurate data.